No one at Newport Beach's bustling boardwalk could have predicted how a simple act of cruelty would unleash a chain of events that would leave their community forever changed. When a notorious motorcycle gang leader decided to target a blind, veteran's German shepherd as a cruel prank, he had no idea he was about to confront one of the military's most decorated Special Operations K9s. What happened next would become a story of loyalty, courage, and justice that no one would ever forget. The morning sun cast long shadows across Newport Beach's Ocean Boulevard as David Matthews walked with measured steps alongside his German shepherd, Shadow. The gentle ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and coffee from the nearby cafes, a familiar comfort that helped David navigate his world of darkness. At 42, the former Navy SEAL had learned to trust his other senses, but none more than the unwavering presence of his four-legged companion. Shadow wasn't just any guide dog. His muscular frame and alert posture spoke of years of rigorous training, though few who passed them on their morning walks knew his true background. Before becoming David's guide, Shadow had served 3 tours in Afghanistan as part of the Special Operations K9 unit, where his exceptional ability to detect threats had saved countless lives. The pair made their way to the Coastal Brew, a cozy coffee shop nestled between the beach and the bustling downtown area. It was their morning ritual, one that brought structure to David's life since losing his sight in a training accident 5 years ago. The owner, Sarah Chen, greeted them with the same warmth she showed every morning. "The usual, David?" she called out, already preparing his favorite dark roast. "Shadow looks particularly vigilant today." David smiled in the direction of her voice, one hand resting on Shadow's harness. "He's always on guard, aren't you, boy?" The German shepherd's ears twitched at the mention of his name, but his eyes remained focused on their surroundings, scanning the morning crowd with practiced precision. The outdoor seating area buzzed with the usual mix of early morning patrons, joggers grabbing their pre-run caffeine fix, business people typing away on laptops, and tourists already planning their beach activities. David and Shadow took their regular table, positioned perfectly to catch the morning sun while staying away from the main foot traffic. As David sipped his coffee, Shadow lay at his feet, appearing relaxed, but maintaining the alertness that had been ingrained through years of military service. Every now and then, his ears would prick at a sudden sound, his training never fully forgotten despite his new civilian life. The peaceful morning atmosphere was interrupted by the distant rumble of motorcycle engines, growing louder as they approached Ocean Boulevard. Shadow's posture shifted slightly, a change so subtle that only David could feel it through the harness. The dog's muscles tensed, though he remained perfectly still, his eyes tracking the new arrivals. 3 motorcycles pulled into the parking area across from the coffee shop, their engines cutting through the gentle sound of waves and conversation. The riders, clad in leather jackets decorated with patches, declaring their allegiance to the Coastal Reapers, dismounted with an air of practiced intimidation. Their leader, Ray Martinez, stood out even among his companions. His jacket, adorned with more patches than the others, spoke of his status within the gang. Fresh out of a 2-year stint in prison, Ray had something to prove to his crew, and the peaceful morning scene before him presented an opportunity he couldn't resist. As the bikers made their way toward the coffee shop, Shadow's ears flattened slightly, his body remaining still but alert. David, sensing the subtle change in his companion's behavior, placed a reassuring hand on the dog's neck. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Now back to the story." "Easy, boy," he whispered, unaware of the approaching threat that Shadow had already identified. The morning sun continued to climb, casting shorter shadows across the boardwalk as the first chapter of what would become a legendary story began to unfold. No one at the Coastal Brew that morning could have predicted how their peaceful community was about to be shaken by what would happen next. Ray Martinez surveyed the coffee shop's patio, his dark eyes lingering on each patron before settling. On David and Shadow, the German Shepherd's presence had caught his attention, stirring something in him that he couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the dog's unusual alertness, or perhaps it was simply the prospect of entertainment on what had started as a mundane morning. "Check out the blind guy's dog," Ray muttered to his companions, Derek and Tony, who flanked him like shadows. "Looks like it thinks it's some kind of bodyguard." His voice carried a hint of amusement, tinged with malice, a combination that had become his trademark during his time behind bars. The trio made their way between the tables, their heavy boots scraping against the concrete. Several patrons glanced up nervously, some discreetly gathering their belongings closer. Sarah Chen watched from behind the counter, her hand hovering near the phone. Years of running a beachfront business having taught her to recognize trouble before it started. Shadow's ears remained forward, his eyes tracking Ray's every movement while maintaining perfect stillness. It was a behavior learned in combat zones where the slightest twitch could give away a position. David, sensing the change in the atmosphere, sat straighter in his chair, one hand resting lightly on Shadow's harness. "Man, that's one serious-looking dog you've got there," Ray called out, stopping a few feet from their table. His voice was friendly enough, but there was an undercurrent that Shadow picked up immediately. The German Shepherd's muscles tensed imperceptibly, ready to move at a moment's notice. David turned his head toward Ray's voice, offering a polite but reserved smile. "Thank you, Shadow's my partner." His response was measured, years of military training, evident in his composed demeanor. Ray stepped closer, ignoring the warning signs in Shadow's body language. "Shadow, huh? Fancy name for a dog." He reached out toward Shadow's head, a move that caused several nearby patrons to hold their breath. The German Shepherd remained perfectly still, but his eyes never left Ray's hand. David, feeling the tension through the harness, spoke again, his voice firmer this time. "He's working right now. Please don't distract him." Ray pulled his hand back, but the smile that spread across his face didn't reach his eyes. "Working? Sitting at a coffee shop? That's a pretty sweet gig." His companions chuckled, the sound harsh against the morning quiet. Sarah Chen emerged from behind the counter, coffee pot in hand, her presence deliberate as she approached nearby tables. "Can I get you gentlemen anything?" she asked, her tone professional but clipped. "Nah, we're just admiring the dog," Ray replied, his eyes still fixed on Shadow. "Seems kind of stuck up, doesn't he? Maybe he needs to learn to be more friendly." The threat in his words was subtle but clear. Shadow's ears flattened slightly, a low rumble building in his chest. A sound so quiet only David could hear. It was a warning the dog had learned to give in the mountains of Afghanistan, where threats often came disguised as casual encounters. David's grip tightened on the harness, his military training kicking in as he assessed the situation through his other senses, the positioning of voices, the subtle shifts in the air as people moved, the tension in Shadow's body. "We should be going," he said, starting to rise from his chair. Ray stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Hey, no rush. We've got all morning to get acquainted." His companions moved to flank him again, creating a loose semicircle around David's table. Shadow's posture shifted slightly, angling his body to better protect his partner. The morning sun now illuminated the scene fully, casting no shadows to hide the growing tension. Along the boardwalk, people slowed their pace, some stopping to watch the scene unfold, others pulling out their phones. The peaceful morning had transformed into something else entirely, and everyone present could feel it. The tension at the Coastal Brew had drawn a small crowd of onlookers, their morning routines forgotten in the face of the unfolding drama. Among them stood Mark Rodriguez, an off-duty police officer who had stopped for his morning coffee. He watched the scene with growing concern, his hand instinctively touching the concealed weapon at his hip. Ray's attention shifted momentarily to the gathering crowd, a slight smirk playing across his face. He lived for moments like these, when all eyes were on him, when he could demonstrate his power over others. Prison had taught him that perception was everything, and right now everyone was watching. "You know," Ray said, turning back to David, "I've always wondered about these service dogs. How good are they really?" He took a step closer, prompting Shadow to shift his weight almost imperceptibly. The German Shepherd's training was evident in his restraint. In a different life, in a different place, he would have already taken action. David remained outwardly calm, but his years of SEAL training had taught him to recognize the signs of imminent conflict. The way Ray's voice carried across the patio, the positioning of his companions, the subtle shuffle of their feet. It all painted a clear picture in his mind. "Shadow is highly trained," David replied evenly, his hand steady on the harness, "and he takes his job very seriously." The warning in his voice was clear to anyone who knew what to listen for. Sarah Chen had moved closer to the counterphone, her fingers hovering over the keypad. She'd seen trouble before, but something about Ray's demeanor set off every alarm bell she had. Around the patio, other patrons began to slowly gather their belongings, creating a subtle exodus from the immediate area. "Highly trained, huh?" Ray chuckled, the sound hollow and sharp. "Looks pretty soft to me. Probably spent his whole life being pampered, leading around blind people." He glanced at his companions, encouraging their laughter. What Ray couldn't see, what his prison-hardened instincts failed to recognize, was the way Shadow's eyes tracked every minute movement, categorizing and assessing threats just as he had done in combat zones. The German Shepherd's military training had taught him to remain still until action was absolutely necessary, a skill that had saved lives. In the mountains of Afghanistan, David's voice took on a harder edge, memories of his own combat experience surfacing. "I suggest you move along now. We're trying to enjoy our morning." The authority in his tone was unmistakable. It was the voice of a man who had commanded others in life-or-death situations. Ray's expression darkened. He hadn't spent 2 years in prison to be ordered around by a blind man. "Or what?" he challenged, taking another step forward. "Your pampered pooch going to do something about it?" Shadow remained motionless, but his muscles were coiled tight, ready to respond to any threat. His military training had ingrained in him the patience to wait for the perfect moment, to let the aggressor make the first mistake. Mark Rodriguez began making his way closer to the scene, trying to appear casual while maintaining a tactical advantage. He'd dealt with the coastal reapers before and knew their reputation for unpredictable violence. The morning breeze had picked up, carrying with it the sound of distant waves and the growing murmur of the crowd. Some had their phones out, recording the confrontation, while others watched with nervous anticipation. The peaceful soundtrack of Newport Beach had been replaced by the heavy atmosphere of impending conflict. Ray glanced at the crowd again, then back at David and Shadow. His next move would define the morning, and he had something to prove. His time in prison had taught him that respect came through fear, and right now he had the perfect audience to demonstrate just how fearsome he could be. Ray's fingers drummed against his leather jacket, brushing over a patch that read, "Fear no one." The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, feeling increasingly agitated by a blind man and his dog. Behind him, Derek and Tony exchanged glances, sensing their leader's growing frustration. "You know what I think?" Ray announced, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "I think this whole service dog thing is a scam. Bet I could train any mutt to walk in a straight line." His voice carried the edge of someone used to having his opinions heard and feared. David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. During his SEAL training, he'd learned that the most dangerous moments often came right before an attack, when tensions reached their peak and someone inevitably made a mistake. Right now, every instinct told him they were approaching that moment. Shadows. Ears twitched at a subtle movement from Derek, who had shifted his weight to the balls of his feet. The German Shepherd's military training had taught him to recognize pre-attack postures, and right now, all three men were displaying classic signs of imminent aggression. Sarah Chen had already dialed 911, keeping the phone hidden below the counter. Her quiet voice carried urgency as she described the situation to the dispatcher. Yes, at the Coastal Brew. 3 men harassing a disabled veteran and his service dog. Please hurry. Let me show you something, Ray said, his voice taking on a dangerous playfulness. He reached into his jacket pocket, the movement causing Shadow to stiffen slightly. What emerged was not a weapon, but a half-eaten breakfast burrito wrapped in foil. Officer Rodriguez watched as Ray unwrapped the burrito, his experienced eye noting how the biker's other hand stayed close to his belt. Years on the force had taught him to read body language, and everything about this situation screamed of calculated provocation. "Hey, doggy," Ray called out, holding up the burrito. "Want a treat? Come on, show everyone you're just a regular dog." He waved the food tauntingly, ignoring David's firm command to stop. Shadow didn't move a muscle, his training holding firm. In Afghanistan, he'd learned to ignore distractions that could lead to deadly mistakes. Food, noise, movement, none of it mattered when he was in work mode. David's military experience told him that Ray wasn't really interested in feeding his dog. This was a power play, an attempt to assert dominance over the situation. "Shadow won't take food from strangers," he stated firmly. "He's working." Ray's face darkened at the rejection. Prison had taught him that disrespect, no matter how small, had to be answered. "Maybe he just needs some encouragement," he sneered, taking another step forward. The crowd had grown larger, with some morning beachgoers stopping to watch the scene unfold. Phones recorded the confrontation, their owners perhaps sensing that something significant was about to happen. Tony, the youngest of the 3 bikers, shifted uncomfortably. "Ray, maybe we should—" he started, but a sharp look from his leader silenced him immediately. No, Ray cut him off. "I want to see what makes this dog so special." He crumpled, the burrito in his hand, letting the foil crackle loudly. "Come on, boy, don't you want to play?" Shadow's eyes remained locked on Ray, his body perfectly still, but ready. Years of military service had honed his ability to remain calm under pressure, but also to recognize when a situation was about to turn violent. The morning sun had climbed higher, and the normal sounds of Newport Beach seemed to fade into the background. The crash of waves, the cry of seagulls, the chatter of tourists, all of it dimmed in the face of the mounting tension at the Coastal Brew. "What?" he challenged, taking another step forward. The crumpled burrito hit the ground near Shadow's paws, a deliberate provocation that Ray punctuated with a harsh laugh. The German Shepherd didn't even glance at it, his training far too ingrained to be distracted by such obvious baiting. In the mountains of Afghanistan, such focus had meant the difference between life and death. "Some guard dog you've got," Ray sneered, his prison yard bravado growing with each passing moment. "Won't even go for food. Maybe he's just stupid." He looked around at the crowd, seeking validation, but found only uncomfortable stares and recording phones. David's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on Shadow's harness. During his SEAL operations, he'd learned to read the atmosphere before a firefight, the subtle shift in air pressure, the way sounds seemed to dampen, the electricity that seemed to charge the space between combatants. He felt it all now. Officer Rodriguez had positioned himself closer, maintaining what appeared to be casual interest while calculating intervention angles. His hand stayed near his concealed weapon, though he hoped the situation wouldn't escalate to that point. "You know what?" Ray announced, his voice carrying across the now silent patio. "I'm tired of this stuck-up mutt." He took a step forward, his boot deliberately scuffing against the concrete. "Time to teach both of you some manners." Sarah Chen's voice carried from behind the counter, sharp and clear. "That's enough. Leave them alone, or I'm calling the police." She held up her phone, making it clear she wasn't bluffing. Ray's head snapped toward her, his face darkening. "Mind your own business, lady." But the interruption had pricked his ego. In prison, any challenge to his authority had required immediate response. His next actions would be driven by that ingrained need to dominate. Without warning, Ray's boot shot out, catching the side of David's chair. The metal scraped against concrete as it shifted slightly. Shadow's response was immediate but measured. He rose to his full height, positioning himself more firmly between David and the threat. "Oh, now you want to play?" Ray taunted, emboldened by the dog's reaction. Derek and Tony moved to flank him, though Tony's reluctance was visible in his hesitant steps. David's voice cut through the tension, carrying the unmistakable authority of a military commander. "This is your last warning. Back off." His words weren't just a suggestion, they were a promise. But Ray was too far gone, too invested in his display of dominance. Prison had taught him that backing down meant weakness, and weakness meant vulnerability. His next move would change everything. "Last warning," he mocked, taking another step forward. "What are you going to do about it, blind man? Sick your pampered puppy on me?" His hand shot out, shoving David's shoulder roughly. The moment Ray's hand made contact with David, Shadow's demeanor transformed. Gone was the passive service dog, replaced by the highly trained military K9 that had faced down insurgents in combat zones. His stance shifted subtly, muscles coiled and ready. The crowd sensed the change, a collective intake of breath marking the moment. Officer Rodriguez began moving more purposefully toward the scene, recognizing that intervention was now inevitable. Ray, caught up in his own bravado, missed the warning signs that any military personnel would have recognized instantly. Shadow's eyes had taken on a focused intensity, his ears forward, his body perfectly aligned for action. "What's wrong, doggy?" Ray sneered, high on his perceived dominance of the situation. "Don't like seeing your master pushed around?" His foot drew back, and in that moment time seemed to slow for everyone watching. The morning sun caught the scene in perfect clarity, Ray's boot beginning its arc toward Shadow, David's face showing the first signs of real concern, and Shadow's body tensing in a way that spoke of years of specialized training. The peaceful Newport Beach morning was about to shatter completely. Ray's boot never reached its target. In a movement so fluid it seemed almost choreographed, Shadow exploded into action. Years of military training condensed into a split second as the German Shepherd intercepted Ray's kick with a precision that left the crowd gasping. Shadow didn't attack. His response was far more calculated. Using techniques honed in combat, zones, he positioned himself to completely control the space between Ray and David. His stance was low, powerful, and unmistakably professional. This wasn't an angry dog's reaction. This was a trained military operator at work. "What the—" Ray stumbled backward, his prison bravado cracking as he faced something entirely outside his experience. The German Shepherd's eyes locked onto him with an intensity that spoke of years of combat experience. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This wasn't the docile service dog he'd been taunting. This was something else entirely. Officer Rodriguez had drawn closer, his trained eye recognizing Shadow's tactical positioning. "That's no ordinary service dog," he called out, his voice carrying authority. "Stand down now." His hand remained near his weapon, though he could see that Shadow was showing remarkable restraint. David's voice cut through the chaos. calm but commanding. "Shadow, hold!" The German shepherd responded instantly to the military command, maintaining his protective stance while waiting for further instructions. In Afghanistan, such precise control had been essential during high-stakes operations. The crowd had drawn back, phones still recording as the scene unfolded. Sarah Chen stood frozen behind her counter, the 911 dispatcher's voice still crackling through her phone. The morning sun caught the scene in stark relief. Ray and his companions backing away, Shadow's powerful form holding ground, and David's composed presence anchoring it all. "Your dog's crazy," Ray shouted, but the tremor in his voice betrayed his fear. Prison had taught him to recognize real threats, and something in Shadow's demeanor told him he'd severely miscalculated. Derek tugged at Ray's jacket. "Man, that's no regular dog," he muttered, his eyes fixed on Shadow's unwavering stance. "Look at how it moves. That's military training." The realization seemed to hit Ray all at once. The dog's discipline, its controlled response, its tactical positioning. This wasn't just a service animal. His face paled as he remembered news stories about military K9 units and their extensive combat experience. Shadow served 3 tours in Afghanistan, David stated, his voice carrying across the now silent patio. Special Operations K9 unit. He's trained to handle threats, far worse than playground bullies. The statement wasn't a boast, it was simply fact. Officer Rodriguez stepped forward, his badge now visible. "I suggest you leave right now." His tone left no room for argument. "Before I decide to arrest you for assault and harassment." Ray's prison instincts warred with his growing fear. Shadow hadn't moved a muscle, but his presence radiated controlled power. Every attempt Ray made to shift position was met with a subtle adjustment from the German shepherd, maintaining perfect control of the situation. Tony had already backed away, wanting no part of what had become a serious miscalculation. "Ray, let's go," he urged, his earlier reluctance now full-blown concern. "This isn't worth it." The morning crowd at the Coastal Brew had grown larger, drawn by the confrontation. Among them, several veterans had moved closer, recognizing in Shadow's bearing the hallmarks of professional military training. Ray made one last attempt to salvage his pride. "This isn't over," he growled, though his body language said otherwise. Shadow's only response was a low, professional rumble, not the bark of an angry dog, but the warning of a trained operator. As Ray and his companions retreated to their motorcycles, the tension in the air remained electric. Shadow maintained his protective stance until the roar of motorcycle engines faded into the distance, his military training keeping him focused until the threat was completely gone. Only then did his posture soften slightly, though his alertness never wavered. Officer Rodriguez approached David's table, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "I'm going to need to take a statement," he said, pulling out a small notebook. "That was quite a situation you had there." His eyes studied Shadow with newfound respect, recognizing the telltale signs of professional military training. Sarah Chen emerged from behind her counter, carrying fresh coffee. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the cup in front of David. "This one's on the house," she said, her voice still shaky. Shadow was incredible." David reached out, finding the coffee cup with practiced ease. "Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for trying to intervene." His voice was steady, but those who knew him well might have detected the slight tension, the echoes of combat readiness that never quite fade. A small group of veterans who had witnessed the scene approached the table. One of them, an older man with a Marine Corps cap, spoke up. "That's definitely a Special Operations K9. I worked with them in Kandahar. You can tell by the way he controlled the situation. Minimum force, maximum effect." Shadow's ears twitched at the familiar military terminology, but his eyes continued scanning the surroundings. In Afghanistan, he'd learned that the aftermath of one confrontation could often lead to another. David sensed his companion's continued vigilance and placed a calming hand on his neck. 3 tours, you said? Officer Rodriguez asked, pen poised over his notebook. Mind if I ask where? His casual tone belied his professional interest. The coastal reapers had been causing increasing problems in Newport Beach, and this incident would need careful documentation. David nodded, his hand still resting on Shadow's fur. Kandahar, mainly. Shadow was part of an elite K9 unit specializing in threat detection and neutralization. We didn't meet until after. His voice trailed off. The memory of the training accident that took his sight still fresh. The crowd had begun to disperse, though many remained nearby, phones still out, discussing what they'd witnessed. The video would undoubtedly spread through Newport Beach's community, adding another layer of complexity to an already tense situation. Sarah returned with water for Shadow, placing the bowl carefully within David's reach. The police dispatcher said more units are on the way, she informed them. They want to take statements from everyone who witnessed it. David's military experience told him this wasn't over. Men like Ray, especially those with prison backgrounds, didn't take public humiliation lightly. Shadow, he said quietly, stay sharp. The German shepherd's ears perked at the command, understanding in his bearing that they were still in a tactical situation. The Marine Corps veteran lingered, watching Shadow with knowing eyes. Your dog saved lives over there, didn't he? It wasn't really a question. You can see it in the way he handles himself. The precision, the control, that's not something you learn in basic K9 training. David's expression shifted slightly, memories of his own combat experiences surfacing. Shadow's unit specialized in high-risk operations, the kind where one wrong move. He left the sentence unfinished, but every veteran present understood. Officer Rodriguez finished taking notes and pulled out his card. I'm going to file a formal report, but I want you to have my direct number, the Coastal Reapers. They've been escalating their activities lately. Ray Martinez just got out of prison 2 months ago, and he's got something to prove. The morning sun now hung high over Newport Beach, its warmth doing little to dispel the chill that had settled over the Coastal Brew's patio. Shadow remained at his post, his bearing making it clear that while the first battle was over, the war might just be beginning. The Coastal Reapers clubhouse sat on the outskirts of Newport Beach, a converted warehouse that bore the scars of countless late-night revelries. Ray Martinez burst through the door, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. The morning's events played on repeat in his mind, each replay stoking the fires of his wounded pride. "A dog!" he shouted, kicking over a bar stool. A guide dog made me look like a fool." The empty clubhouse absorbed his words, the few early morning members watching their leader's meltdown with careful neutrality. Prison had taught them when to speak and when to stay silent. Derek leaned against the bar, his weathered face thoughtful. "That wasn't just a guide dog, Ray. You heard what they said? Special Operations, military trained. We're lucky it didn't go worse." He'd served a brief stint in the army before his dishonorable discharge, and something about Shadow's bearing had triggered old memories. Tony, the youngest of the group, sat in the corner nursing a beer, his face still pale from the morning's encounter. "Maybe we should just let this one go," he suggested, immediately regretting his words as Ray's fierce gaze locked onto him. "Let it go?" Ray's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides, looming over Tony. 2 years in Chino taught me one thing: you never let disrespect slide. Never. His knuckles whitened around the beer bottle he held. Through the clubhouse's grimy windows, the late morning sun cast long shadows across the floor. The air inside was thick with cigarette smoke and tension as Ray paced, his mind working through scenarios of revenge. The incident at the Coastal Brew had already spread across social media, video clips showing his retreat from a service dog. "I've got contacts from Chino," Ray muttered, more to himself than his companions. "People who know how to handle problems like this." His hand unconsciously touched the prison tattoo on his neck, a reminder of lessons learned behind bars. The clubhouse door creaked open, admitting Marco, one of the Reaper's more seasoned members. He'd missed the morning's excitement, but his phone had been buzzing with messages. "Heard about what happened," he said, pulling up a stool. "Word's spreading fast. The dog's got quite a history from what I'm hearing." Ray's eyes narrowed. "What kind of history?" Marco pulled out, his phone scrolling through messages. "Guy I know works at the VA, says that dog, Shadow, was part of some elite unit. Multiple combat deployments, specialized training, the kind of dog they use for high-risk operations." The information only seemed to fuel Ray's anger. His time in prison had taught him that reputation was everything, and right now, his was. Taking a serious hit. Videos of him backing down from a blind man's dog were circulating, undermining everything he'd built since his release. "The blind guy," Ray said suddenly, his voice taking on a calculating edge. "What's his story?" Derek shifted uncomfortably. "David Matthews, former Navy SEAL, from what the crowd was saying, lost his sight in some kind of training accident about 5 years ago." He paused, then added, "He's respected in the community, Ray. This isn't like hassling some random tourist." But Ray wasn't listening. His mind was already churning with possibilities, prison-hardened instincts formulating. Plans. "Every man has a weakness," he said, almost to himself. "Every dog has a breaking point. We just need to find it." Tony stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I didn't sign up for this, Ray. Messing with a disabled vet? That's not what the Reapers are about." Several other members nodded in agreement, but fell silent when Ray slammed his bottle on the bar. "The Reapers are about whatever I say they're about," Ray's voice echoed through the clubhouse. "I didn't spend 2 years in Chino to come out and let some blind man and his mutt make me look weak. We're going to handle this, and we're going to handle it my way." The morning sun had reached its peak outside, but inside the clubhouse, shadows continued to lengthen as Ray Martinez plotted his revenge, unaware that he was about to start a chain of events that would shake Newport Beach to its core. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across David's modest beachside apartment as Officer Rodriguez concluded his follow-up visit. The videos of the morning's confrontation had gone viral across Newport Beach's social media, drawing attention that made David increasingly uneasy. Shadow lay alert by the door, his posture revealing that the morning's events had activated deeply ingrained combat instincts. "We're increasing patrols in the area," Rodriguez explained, closing his notebook. "But there's something you should know about Ray Martinez. His prison record shows a pattern of escalating revenge attacks. He doesn't let things go easily." The officer's voice carried the weight of experience dealing with the coastal Reapers. David nodded, his military training already having led him to similar conclusions. "In the SEALs, we learned that the aftermath of an engagement often posed more dangers than the initial confrontation." His hand found Shadow's fur, drawing comfort from the dog's solid presence. "Shadow knows it too. He hasn't relaxed since this morning." A knock at the door caused Shadow to stiffen, but his reaction was controlled. A professional assessment rather than alarm. Rodriguez opened it to reveal Sarah Chen carrying a bag of fresh pastries from the Coastal Brew. Behind her stood James Morrison, the Marine veteran who had recognized Shadow's training earlier. "The whole community's talking about what happened," Sarah said, setting the bag down on David's kitchen counter. "I've had customers all day asking how they can help." Nobody wants the Reapers thinking they can get away with this kind of behavior. Morrison moved with the deliberate grace of a combat veteran as he took a seat. I've reached out to some of my old Marine buddies in the area. We're organizing an unofficial neighborhood watch. The Reapers need to understand that they're not just dealing with one blind vet and his dog. Shadow's ears perked up at Morrison's familiar military bearing, recognizing a potential ally. The German Shepherd had been trained to work with various military units in Afghanistan, and that cooperative instinct remained sharp. I appreciate the support, David began, but I don't want anyone else getting caught in the crossfire. Ray's anger is directed at me and Shadow. His voice carried the authority of someone used to protecting others, even now. Rodriguez shook his head. This is bigger than just you and Shadow now. The Reapers have been pushing boundaries for months. The community's finally pushing back. He paused, checking his phone. The videos from this morning have reached the department's Community Relations Office. They're taking this seriously. Sarah moved to the window, looking out at the peaceful street below. Some of my regular customers are local business owners. They're installing new security cameras, sharing information. Nobody wants to see the Reapers turn Newport Beach into their personal playground. Shadow suddenly rose, moving to the window with practiced stealth. His posture suggested professional interest rather than immediate threat assessment. A motorcycle had passed by, not necessarily one of the Reapers, but the dog's training left nothing to chance. That's what worries me, David said, reading Shadow's behavior through the harness. Ray strikes me as the type to take community resistance as a personal challenge. In the SEALs, we called it target fixation. When someone becomes so focused on their objective that they lose sight of the consequences. Morrison nodded grimly. I've seen his type in combat zones. The more opposition they face, the more determined they become. But that's exactly why the community needs to stand united. Bullies like Ray prey on isolated targets. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting longer shadows across the apartment. Shadow remained by the window, his vigilance a reminder that the day's events were likely just the beginning. The German Shepherd's military training had taught him that peace was often the quiet before the storm. Whatever Ray's planning, Rodriguez said, standing to leave, he should remember one thing. He's not in prison anymore. Here, actions have consequences, and the whole community is watching. His words carried both reassurance and warning, echoing the sentiment building throughout Newport Beach. The neon signs of Joe's Bar cast a sickly glow across the parking lot where Ray Martinez sat in his pickup truck, watching the entrance of David's apartment building through his rearview mirror. 2 days of surveillance had taught him the blind veteran's routine. Morning coffee runs with the dog, afternoon walks along the beach, evening visits from various community members. This isn't just about the dog anymore, Ray muttered to Derek, who sat tensely in the passenger seat. The whole damn town thinks they can stand against the Reapers. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel, a habit he'd picked up during long nights in his prison cell. Derek shifted uncomfortably, watching another patrol car make its third pass of the hour. Ray, the heat's pretty heavy right now. Maybe we should... He fell silent as Ray's hand gripped his arm, prison-hardened muscles tensing with barely controlled rage. You going soft on me too? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ray's voice carried the dangerous edge that his fellow inmates had learned to fear. Like Tony and the others? The younger members of the Reapers had been conspicuously absent lately, their group chats silent. A figure emerged from David's building, James Morrison, the Marine veteran who'd been organizing the neighborhood watch. Shadow's distinctive silhouette was visible through the ground floor window, the German Shepherd's attention seemingly fixed in their direction, despite the distance and darkness. That dog knows we're here, Derek muttered, suppressing a shiver. Military training, man. They say those K9s in Afghanistan could detect threats from hundreds of yards away. His brief military service had taught him enough to respect what he'd seen in Shadow's bearing. Ray's lip curled in contempt. Every dog has a weakness. Every man has a breaking point. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages from contacts he'd made in Chino's state prison. I've got someone coming in from Los Angeles, specializes in handling problems like this. The street had grown quiet, most businesses closed for the night. Only Joe's bar still buzzed with activity, its regular crowd oblivious to the surveillance taking place in their parking lot. Ray's eyes narrowed as he watched Morrison drive away, leaving David's apartment under the watchful protection of his combat-trained companion. Tomorrow night, Ray announced, starting his truck's engine. I've got it all planned out. My contact's bringing something that'll take care of our dog problem real quick. His voice carried the cold calculation of someone who'd learned patience in a prison cell. Derek glanced at his leader, noting the familiar expression. The same look Ray had worn before orchestrating some of their most violent confrontations. What about all the cameras they've installed? The increased patrols? Ray's laugh was hollow, echoing in the truck's cabin. Technology can fail. Cops can be distracted. He pulled out a folded paper from his jacket, a detailed schedule of police patrol patterns obtained through less than legal means. By the time anyone responds, it'll be too late. The truck pulled out of Joe's bar's parking lot, its headlights off until it reached the main street. Ray's mind was already racing through the steps of his plan, each detail honed by years of prison yard calculations. First, we take care of the dog. Then, when the blind man's vulnerable, we show this whole town what happens when you disrespect the coastal reapers. As they drove through Newport Beach's quiet streets, neither man noticed the dark sedan that pulled away from the curb 2 blocks behind them. Officer Rodriguez kept a careful distance, his dash cam recording their movements while he spoke quietly into his radio. The night air carried a hint of ocean spray, but the usual peaceful atmosphere of Newport Beach had been replaced by something more ominous. In his apartment, David sat in his favorite chair, one hand resting on Shadow's head, as the German shepherd maintained his vigil by the window. Both man and dog had survived enough combat situations to recognize the calm before the storm. Dawn broke over Newport Beach with an unusual tension in the air. David sat at his kitchen table, listening to Officer Rodriguez detail the previous night's surveillance findings. Shadow stood at attention by the window, his posture reflecting the heightened alert status that both man and dog had maintained since the confrontation at the coastal brew. They were watching your building for at least 2 hours, Rodriguez explained, his voice tight with concern. Ray made contact with someone in Los Angeles, a character with a history of violent crimes. Whatever they're planning, it's going to happen soon. David's fingers traced the rim of his coffee cup, his military training kicking in as he processed the information. Shadow's been more alert than usual. In Afghanistan, he could sense an ambush being prepared days in advance. Those instincts don't fade. Sarah Chen burst through the door, barely waiting for Shadow's acknowledging tail wag before rushing to the table. David, you need to hear this. She placed her phone on the table, playing a recording from her security cameras. Ray's voice crackled through the speaker, discussing plans with someone about handling the dog situation. Shadow's ears pricked forward at the sound of Ray's voice, his body tensing as if preparing for immediate action. David reached out, finding the dog's fur with practiced ease. Easy boy, not yet. The command carried echoes of their shared combat experience, the wisdom of waiting for the right moment. Morrison arrived next, his Marine training evident in the way he immediately took stock of the apartment's defensive positions. I've got 4 combat vets watching the building's approaches. If the Reapers try anything, they won't have the element of surprise. That might make them more dangerous, David cautioned, years of SEAL experience coloring his words. When you take away a predator's advantage, they often resort to more desperate tactics. His hand hadn't left Shadow's fur, feeling the subtle vibrations of the dog's heightened alertness. Rodriguez's radio crackled with updates from his patrol units. The Reapers had been spotted gathering at their clubhouse, including several unfamiliar faces. Ray's contact from LA arrived this morning, he reported. Known associate of some dangerous people. This is escalating faster than we anticipated. Sarah moved to the window, peering out at the seemingly peaceful street below. The whole community's on edge. I've had to turn customers away from the coastal brew. People are worried about getting caught in the crossfire if the Reapers show up again. Shadow suddenly moved from his position, crossing to the apartment's front door with silent, practiced steps. Seconds later, footsteps became audible in the hallway. Morrison's hand moved instinctively to his hip before Tony, the youngest of the Reapers, appeared in the doorway, his face pale with urgency. "I can't be seen here," Tony said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you need to know. Ray's guy from LA. He brought something bad. They're not just planning to scare you anymore." His eyes darted between the assembled faces, landing finally on Shadow's alert form. David stood, his posture shifting subtly into a combat-ready stance that his SEAL training had ingrained. "What exactly did they bring, Tony?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Tony swallowed hard. The kind of stuff they used to use in dogfighting rings. But worse. Ray's completely lost it. He's talking about making an example, something the whole town will remember. He backed toward the door, fear evident in his movements. "I never signed up for this kind of thing. Just be careful." As Tony's footsteps faded down the hallway, the atmosphere in the apartment grew heavier. Shadow returned to his post by the window, but his posture had changed. This was no longer just a guard dog on alert. This was a combat veteran preparing for battle. The back room of the Coastal Reapers clubhouse had become a war room of sorts, with Ray Martinez studying a crude map of Newport Beach spread across a scarred pool table. His contact from Los Angeles, a heavyset man known only as Vicente, laid out several small vials beside the map, their contents casting amber shadows under the harsh fluorescent lights. "This stuff," Vicente explained, his voice carrying the rasp of too many cigarettes, "used to clear out fighting dogs that got too dangerous to handle. No trace, no evidence. Just looks like the mutt had a heart attack." His fingers drummed. Against the pool table's worn felt prison tattoos, visible on each knuckle, Ray's eyes narrowed as he examined the vials. 2 years in Chino had taught him that reputation was built on decisive action. But this felt different, deeper, more personal. "And you're sure it's untraceable?" His voice carried an edge that made even Derek shift uncomfortably. "Been used in underground rings for years," Vicente assured him, pocketing a thick envelope of cash. "But you got to be careful with the timing. Too soon after a confrontation, cops get suspicious. You want it to look natural. Give it a few days." The clubhouse had emptied out considerably since Tony's disappearance. Several longtime members had made excuses to distance themselves, sensing that their leader's vendetta was crossing lines they weren't willing to approach. Only Derek and 3 newer members remained, their loyalty born more of fear than respect. "I've got the patrol schedules," Ray continued, pointing to marked routes on the map. "Morrison's veterans are watching the apartment, but they're amateurs. They follow patterns, take breaks. We'll wait for the gap." His finger traced a path through the back alleys leading to David's building. Vicente studied the map with professional interest. Military dog like that, though. They're trained to detect threats. Won't be easy getting close enough. He pulled out his phone, showing Ray surveillance photos of Shadow on patrol. "That's not some junkyard mutt you're dealing with." Ray's fist slammed onto the pool table, causing the vials to rattle. I don't need a lecture on the dog's credentials." The outburst carried echoes of prison yard confrontations. "I've watched them for days. The blind man takes him to the beach every afternoon, regular as clockwork." Derek, who had been silent until now, spoke up hesitantly. "Ray, maybe we should think about this. The whole town's watching us now. Even some of our old suppliers are backing off, saying we're bringing too much heat." The look Ray gave him could have frozen hell itself. "You think I care about suppliers, about heat?" He straightened up, his prison-hardened frame casting a long shadow across the map. "This is about respect, about showing everyone what happens when they stand against the Reapers." Vicente gathered his things, preparing to leave. "Whatever you decide, wait at least 48 hours. Let things calm down first. Make it look natural." He paused at the door, adding, "And Ray, if this goes sideways, we never met." After Vicente left, Ray turned to his remaining followers. "Tomorrow afternoon, we'll have someone create a distraction near the coastal brew. While Morrison's veterans are focused there, we'll make our move at the beach." His fingers traced the coastline on the map. "The blind man won't even know what hit him until it's too late." The evening sun cast long shadows through the clubhouse windows as Ray finalized his plans. In his mind, he was back in the prison yard, where every slight demanded a response, where reputation was everything. What he couldn't see, what prison had blinded him to, was how far he had already fallen down a path from which there might be no return. Outside, the rumble of Vicente's car faded into the distance as Newport Beach settled into an uneasy twilight. The calm before the storm was about to end, and only time would tell how many lives would be caught in the gathering darkness. The pre-dawn hours found David Matthews sitting on his balcony, the cool ocean breeze carrying familiar scents that helped him map his world of darkness. Shadow lay at his feet, but the German shepherd's relaxed posture was deceptive. Every few minutes, his ears would twitch at distant sounds, his training never allowing him to fully lower his guard. "You feel it too, don't you, boy?" David murmured, his hand finding Shadow's ear with practiced ease. The dog's subtle shift in position was answer enough. In Afghanistan, they'd both learned to recognize the peculiar stillness that preceded an attack, the same stillness that now blanketed Newport Beach. Inside the apartment, David's phone buzzed with a message from Officer Rodriguez. The surveillance team had observed unusual movement around the Reapers clubhouse late into the night. Several unknown vehicles had arrived and departed, including one registered to a known associate of dogfighting rings in Los Angeles. Shadow's head suddenly lifted, his attention focused on the street below. Moments later, Morrison's quiet footsteps became audible in the hallway. David smiled slightly. The German shepherd's threat detection abilities hadn't dulled since their combat days. "Perimeter check is clear," Morrison reported as he entered, his marine training evident in his precise movement patterns. "But something's off. The usual Reapers lookouts are missing from their spots. It's too quiet." David nodded, years of SEAL experience helping him piece together the tactical situation. "They're preparing something. Shadow's been extra vigilant since yesterday evening." His fingers traced a familiar scar on the dog's neck, a reminder of a close call during their second tour. Morrison settled into a chair, his voice carrying the weight of combat experience. "Remember that time outside Kandahar? The village went all quiet, everyone disappeared inside. We thought they were scared of something coming. Turned out they knew something was coming," David finished, remembering the ambush that had followed. "Shadow gave us the only warning we had. Saved the whole unit." His hand rested on the dog's head, feeling the subtle tension in the muscles. The sound of Sarah Chen's car pulling up drew Shadow's attention momentarily, but his posture remained alert rather than relaxed. She'd been bringing coffee and breakfast every morning since the confrontation, refusing to let David make his usual walk to the coastal brew. "Tony's warning about the dogfighting connection worries me," Sarah said as she set down the coffee. "I've been reading about some cases in Los Angeles, the methods they use." She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. David's military training had taught him to analyze threats methodically. Ray's desperate. Prison taught him to respond to disrespect with overwhelming force, but desperation makes people sloppy. His fingers drummed thoughtfully on his chair. "They'll try something soon, probably today." Shadow stood suddenly, moving to the balcony door with focused intention. His ears were forward, head slightly tilted, a posture David had learned to read during their tours together. "What is it, boy? What do you hear?" Morrison joined Shadow at the door, scanning the street below. 3 motorcycles, moving slow. No headlights. He kept his voice low, though they were likely out of earshot. "Just doing a drive-by, but they're definitely reapers." David's hand found Shadow's harness, feeling the subtle vibrations of the dog's heightened alertness. In Afghanistan, this level of tension from Shadow had always preceded significant action. "They're finalizing their plans, learning our patterns." Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from one of her employees. "Someone's been asking questions at the coffee shop, wanting to know about your usual schedule when you come in." Her voice carried barely controlled anger. "I told everyone not to say a word." The morning sun had begun to paint Newport Beach in soft colors, but the peaceful scene belied the tension building in the air. David ran through combat breathing exercises, centering himself for whatever was coming. Beside him, Shadow maintained his vigilant watch, both man and dog, drawing on years of battlefield experience to prepare for the storm they could feel approaching. The afternoon sun beat down on Newport Beach as Ray Martinez watched through binoculars from his parked van. David and Shadow were making their way along their usual route to the beach, accompanied by Morrison, walking at a discreet distance. The veteran's presence was an irritation, but not an insurmountable one. "Everything's set at the coffee shop," Ray spoke into his phone, his voice carrying the cold precision of a man who'd learned patience in a prison cell. On the other end, one of his newer recruits confirmed that the distraction was in place. A gas leak would soon draw emergency responders and Morrison's veteran watch group away from the beach. Down on the boardwalk, Shadow's pace was measured and professional, but his senses were on high alert. Every few steps, his ears would twitch at different sounds, cataloguing them against the threat assessment training he'd received in Afghanistan. David, sensing the tension through the harness, maintained a steady pace while reaching out with his other senses. "Gas leaks called in," Derek reported from his position near the coastal brew. "Fire department's already responding. Morrison just got a call about it." He watched as the Marine veteran checked his phone, his posture showing clear conflict about leaving his post. Ray allowed himself a small smile. Prison had taught him the value of dividing an enemy's attention. "Wait until they're halfway down the beach," he instructed over the radio to Vicente, who was positioned with the vials in a beach tent they'd set up earlier. "Let them get comfortable first." Morrison approached David, his voice low but carrying urgency. "There's a situation at the coastal brew. Sarah might need help with evacuation." He paused, clearly torn between duties. "Will you be all right here? The beach patrol's been notified to keep an eye out." David nodded, his military training helping him maintain a calm exterior, despite the subtle warnings his other senses were picking up. "We'll be fine. Shadow's got this." His hand found the dog's fur, feeling the controlled tension in the muscles beneath. As Morrison reluctantly headed back toward the coffee shop, Ray watched through his binoculars with growing satisfaction. The beach wasn't crowded for a weekday afternoon, but there were enough people to provide cover for his team's movements. Vicente had positioned himself perfectly, appearing to be just another beachgoer enjoying the sun. Shadow's behavior shifted, subtly as they passed the row of beach tents. His steps became more measured, his head turning slightly to track multiple points of interest. In Afghanistan, this had been his warning pattern for dispersed threats, multiple enemies trying to appear uninvolved but working together. "The blind man's dog is onto something," Vicente's voice crackled over the radio. "These military K9s, they can sense wrong intentions. Might have to move faster than we planned." Ray's fingers tightened on his binoculars. "Stick to the plan. We only get one shot at this." His prison time had taught him the importance of timing, of waiting for the perfect moment when advantage and opportunity aligned. David, picking up on Shadow's changing behavior, began to catalogue his surroundings more actively. The sound of waves, conversations, children playing, and underneath it all, subtle movements that seemed out of place. His SEAL training kicked in as he started building a mental map of potential threats. The afternoon sun continued its arc across the sky as the pieces of Ray's plan moved into position. On the surface, it was just another peaceful day at Newport Beach, but beneath that calm exterior, a carefully orchestrated trap was about to be sprung. Shadow's ears suddenly pricked forward, his body tensing in a way that David immediately recognized from their combat days. Something was wrong, very wrong, and the German Shepherd's military training was telling him exactly where the threat was coming from. The trap was sprung with prison-yard precision. Two of Ray's men emerged from different beach tents, appearing to casually converge on David's position. Vicente remained in his tent, the vials ready. Shadow's muscles tensed beneath David's hand, the German Shepherd's combat training shifting into full tactical mode. "Relax, soldier boy," called out a familiar voice. Ray himself, approaching, in from behind. "Just thought we'd join you for a walk on the beach." His tone carried the false friendliness that often preceded violence in prison yards. David's SEAL training kicked in automatically. His other senses painted a tactical picture. 4, maybe 5 hostiles, moving in a standard flanking pattern. Shadow's subtle shifts through the harness told him even more about their positioning. "Quite a coincidence, running into you here," he replied, buying time while analyzing options. Ray moved closer, his boots crunching on the sand. "No coincidence. See, I've been thinking about our little chat at the coffee shop, thinking real hard." Behind him, Derek and another Reaper spread out, cutting off the path back to the boardwalk. Shadow's warning growl was professional, controlled, the same sound he'd used to alert his unit to imminent threats in Afghanistan. His body shifted, slightly, adopting a defensive posture that would allow quick movement in any direction. "That's right! Show us those teeth!" Ray taunted, now close enough that David could smell the leather of his jacket. "But I wonder how tough you'll be after you get a taste of something special we brought for you." David's mind raced through combat scenarios. The beach wasn't crowded, but there were enough civilians around to complicate things. Shadow's training would prevent him from taking aggressive action unless absolutely necessary. "Whatever you're planning, Ray, think it through. This isn't prison anymore." Vicente emerged from his tent, a water bottle in hand that David couldn't see but Shadow could smell. Something wrong, something dangerous. The German Shepherd's muscles coiled tighter, combat instincts screaming warnings about the threat. "That's where you're wrong," Ray replied, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Everything's prison, just different walls." He nodded to his men, who began to close the circle. "Your dog embarrassed me, made me look weak. In prison, that's a death sentence." Shadow's tactical training took over. He adjusted his position, keeping David at his back while tracking multiple threats. His eyes locked onto the water bottle in Vicente's hand, identifying it as the primary. "Danger. Last chance to walk away," David warned, his voice carrying the authority of a SEAL commander. His hand maintained contact with Shadow's harness, ready to move in sync with his partner's combat expertise. Ray's laugh carried no humor. "Funny. I was about to say the same thing to your dog." He nodded to Vicente, who uncapped the water bottle. "See, we brought him a special drink, something to help him retire." The threat to Shadow changed everything. David's combat experience told him they were out of options. His fingers tightened slightly on the harness, a signal developed during their tours together, telling Shadow to prepare for immediate action. "Now, boys," Ray commanded. Vicente moved forward with the doctored water, while two other Reapers reached for David. They were experienced street fighters, but they'd never faced a military K9 and his handler working in combat synchronization. What happened next would be talked about on Newport Beach for years to come. Shadow and David moved as one, their military training transforming them from an apparent easy target into something the Reapers had never anticipated facing on a peaceful California beach. Shadow moved like liquid lightning, years of Special Operations training unleashing in a precise series of movements. The German Shepherd's first action wasn't to attack, but to circle David rapidly, creating a defensive perimeter that scattered Ray's men and disrupted their coordinated approach. It was a tactical maneuver perfected in combat zones. Control the space, disrupt the enemy's formation. David shifted stance instantly, his SEAL training taking over. Despite his blindness, years of combat experience had taught him to track multiple threats through sound and air pressure changes. "Shadow Guard!" The command activated their practiced combat protocols, transforming them from apparent victims into a coordinated military unit. Vicente lunged forward with the doctored water bottle, but Shadow's response was pure Special Operations precision. The German Shepherd didn't bite. Instead, he executed a shoulder check that sent Vicente sprawling, the bottle flying from his hands. In Afghanistan, this technique had been used to disarm threats without escalating to lethal force. "Get the damn dog!" Ray shouted, his prison yard tactics falling apart in the face of professional military training. He reached for David, expecting to find an easy target. Instead, his hand met empty air as David executed a perfect sidestep, using Shadow's movements as reference points. Shadow's next moves were a demonstration of elite K9 combat training. He didn't chase or attack randomly. Each movement was calculated, herding threats away from David while maintaining tactical control of the space. His barks weren't the angry sounds of an aggressive dog, but the sharp, commanding reports of a military operator coordinating battlefield control. Two of Ray's men tried to flank David from behind. Shadow's response was immediate, a series of precise movements that forced them to cluster together, making them easier to control. It was a technique he'd used in narrow Afghan alleys, controlling multiple threats in confined spaces. "This isn't some junkyard dog," Derek shouted, backing away as he recognized the professional precision in Shadow's movements. "This is military. We need to get out of here." His brief service time had taught him enough to recognize when he was outclassed. David maintained his position, using Shadow's vocal cues to track the battle space. Together, they had controlled similar situations in combat zones, the dog's training complementing the handler's tactical expertise. "Last warning, Ray, back off now." But Ray, driven by prison yard pride, couldn't accept defeat. He pulled something from his jacket, a heavy chain that could serve as a makeshift weapon. "Take the blind man," he commanded, desperation creeping into his voice. "The dog can't watch everything." Shadow's response proved him wrong. The German Shepherd executed a perfect tactical repositioning, placing himself at an angle that covered both David and the new threat. His warning growl carried the full authority of his military training, a final warning before escalation. Beachgoers had scattered, many filming with their phones from a safe distance. They weren't watching a dog fight. They were witnessing years of elite military training in action. Shadow's movements weren't random or aggressive. Each shift, and turn was calculated, professional, designed to control rather than harm. Vicente tried to circle around, reaching for the fallen water bottle. Shadow's response was textbook Special Operations, a precision charge that forced Vicente to abandon his goal and retreat, while never leaving David exposed. The German Shepherd had performed similar maneuvers protecting his unit during compound sweeps in Afghanistan. Through it all, David remained centered and calm, working in perfect synchronization with his partner. Their bond went beyond ordinary. Handler and dog. This was a connection forged in combat zones, refined through years of depending on each other in life or death situations. Together, they were demonstrating why Shadow had been chosen for special operations, and why he and David had become one of the most effective teams in their unit. Ray's prison yard confidence had shattered in the face of professional military efficiency. His carefully planned ambush had transformed into a tactical nightmare as Shadow continued to control the beach with precise, calculated movements. The German Shepherd wasn't just protecting David. He was commanding the entire battle space with special operations precision. "This ends now!" Ray screamed, swinging the chain in a wide arc. Shadow's response was instantaneous and measured, a tactical dodge that positioned him to cut off Ray's escape route while still guarding David. In Afghanistan, this technique had been used to corner insurgents without causing casualties. David tracked the chaos through sound and air movement, his SEAL training allowing him to build a mental map of the confrontation. "Shadow, contain!" The command activated another combat protocol, and the German Shepherd began a series of precise movements designed to herd the threats into a controlled area. Vicente had recovered the water bottle and was trying to circle behind them, but Shadow's battlefield awareness was too refined to miss the flanking attempt. The dog executed a perfect tactical split, maintaining pressure on Ray while using his trained vocals to alert David to the secondary threat. "The dog's got military training," Vicente shouted, his experience with fighting dogs useless against Shadow's professional combat techniques. "This isn't what I signed up for." He backed away, the bottle slipping from his nervous fingers and spilling its doctored contents into the sand. Beachgoers' phones captured every moment as Shadow demonstrated why he'd been chosen for special operations. His movements weren't the random aggression of an attack dog, but the calculated precision of a trained military operator. Each bark, each positioning served a tactical purpose. Ray, desperate to salvage his reputation, made his fatal mistake. "Take them both," he commanded, charging forward with the chain, while Derek and Vicente tried to split David from his protector. It was exactly the kind of uncoordinated attack that Shadow and David had trained to counter in combat zones. What happened next was a masterclass in military K9 operations. Shadow launched into a series of precise tactical movements that their unit had perfected in Afghanistan. He didn't attack. Instead, he used his training to control and incapacitate. Ray's wild swing with the chain met empty air as Shadow executed a perfect flanking maneuver. David, reading Shadow's movements through years of combat experience, shifted in perfect synchronization. Together, they demonstrated why they'd been one of the most effective teams in their unit. "Last chance to surrender, Ray," David called out, his voice carrying the authority of a SEAL commander. But Ray was beyond reasoning, his prison mentality demanding that he dominate or die trying. He charged again, this time aiming directly for David. Shadow's response was textbook Special Operations, a precision takedown that sent Ray sprawling, the chain flying from his grip. The German Shepherd didn't maul or attack. Instead, he pinned Ray with professional efficiency, using techniques developed for subduing threats without causing serious injury. His eyes remained alert, tracking Vicente and Derek while maintaining control of his primary target. "Stand down, all of you!" Morrison's voice cut through the chaos. He and his veteran watch team had realized the gas leak was a diversion and returned at full speed. They moved in with military precision, securing Vicente and Derek while Shadow kept Ray contained. Police sirens wailed in the distance as Ray lay in the sand, his prison-hardened facade crumbling as he faced something he'd never encountered in the yard. The disciplined, professional response of a genuine military team. Shadow maintained his hold, displaying the perfect control that had made him legendary in his unit. Police cruisers lined the beach parking lot as Officer Rodriguez supervised the arrest of Ray and his accomplices. The spilled water bottle had been carefully collected as evidence, its contents already raising serious concerns among the responding officers. Shadow maintained his professional vigilance, his bearing still reflecting his military training even as the immediate threat subsided. "The lab will confirm it, but this looks like the same compound used in those Los Angeles dogfighting cases," Rodriguez explained, sealing the evidence bag. This wasn't just harassment, they were planning something much worse. His eyes moved to Shadow, who stood alertly by David's side, still scanning for potential threats. Sarah Chen pushed through the growing crowd, coffee shop forgotten in her rush to reach them. "David, we figured out the gas leak was fake, but by then—" She stopped, taking in the scene of Ray being loaded into a police car, his prison bravado replaced by sullen defeat. Morrison and his veteran watch team secured the perimeter, their military experience evident in how they managed the crowd of onlookers. "Just like old times, eh, Shadow?" Morrison called out, recognizing the precise, tactical control the German Shepherd had displayed. "Reminds me of that operation outside Kandahar." David's hand hadn't left Shadow's harness, feeling the subtle shift as the dog gradually downgraded from combat readiness to alert monitoring. "He did exactly what he was trained to do," David replied, pride mixing with relief in his voice. "Controlled the situation without causing serious injury." Vicente and Derek were already in custody, both men stammering explanations about being misled about Ray's true intentions. The evidence told a different story: the specialized poison, the coordinated ambush, the careful planning. This hadn't been a simple act of revenge, but a calculated attempt at something far darker. "The videos are already spreading," Sarah reported, checking her phone. "People can't believe what they saw. The way Shadow moved. It wasn't like a regular dog fight at all. The beach was still dotted with people filming, capturing the aftermath of what would become a legendary incident in Newport Beach." Rodriguez approached with a grim expression. "Ray's not talking, but Vicente folded pretty quickly. Turns out, they've been planning this for days. The gas leak, the ambush, the poison, it was all carefully orchestrated." He shook his head in disbelief. "They really thought they could take down a Special Operations K9 with street tactics." Shadow's ears suddenly pricked forward, his body tensing slightly. Seconds later, Tony emerged from the crowd, his face a mix of guilt and relief. "I tried to warn you," he said, approaching carefully under Shadow's watchful gaze. "When I heard what Ray was really planning, I couldn't be part of that." The beach had become a hub of activity, police documenting the scene, witnesses giving statements, veterans from Morrison's watch group explaining to fascinated onlookers about military K9 training. Through it all, Shadow maintained his professional focus, demonstrating why he'd been chosen for special operations. "The DA's taking this very seriously," Rodriguez informed them. "Attempted poisoning of a service animal, premeditated assault, conspiracy. Ray's looking at serious time. His prison record won't help either." The officer's voice carried satisfaction. The coastal reaper's reign of intimidation was effectively over. David absorbed the information while monitoring Shadow's subtle cues through the harness. The German Shepherd was still operating in protection mode, his training too ingrained to stand down completely until they were safely home. It was the same dedication that had kept their unit alive in countless combat situations. As the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, Newport Beach was already buzzing with the story. Not just of a confrontation on the beach, but of the unbreakable bond between a blind veteran and his combat-trained partner. Shadow had demonstrated that his military service wasn't just a past chapter, it was an integral part of who he was, ready to be called upon whenever duty demanded. The morning crowd at the Coastal Brew had tripled in the days following the beach incident. People came not just for coffee, but hoping to catch a glimpse of Shadow and David during their regular visit. The German shepherd's professional demeanor remained unchanged by the attention, his focus solely on his duties and David's protection. "The videos have gone viral," Sarah explained as she set down David's coffee. "People can't stop talking about how Shadow controlled the situation. Veterans, groups are using it as an example of military K9 training in action." She paused, watching Shadow scan the cafe with practiced efficiency. "Though I notice he's still on high alert." David nodded, feeling the subtle tension in Shadow's harness. Combat training doesn't just switch off. In Afghanistan, we learned that the aftermath of an engagement can be just as dangerous as the initial conflict. His hand found Shadow's fur, sensing the controlled vigilance in his partner's muscles. Officer Rodriguez stopped by their table, his notebook in hand. "The DA's office is moving forward with multiple charges. Ray's looking at serious time, attempted assault on a disabled veteran, conspiracy, attempted animal cruelty. His prison record isn't doing him any favors." Through the window, they could see Morrison's veteran watch group still maintaining their presence in the neighborhood. The gas leak diversion had taught them to be more vigilant. Their military experience now focused on preventing any similar incidents. "The coastal reapers are falling apart," Rodriguez continued, accepting a coffee from Sarah. "After the videos spread, their suppliers and allies started distancing themselves. Nobody wants to be associated with someone who'd try to poison a military. K9." His voice carried satisfaction. The gang's influence over Newport Beach was crumbling. Shadow's ears suddenly pricked forward, his body tensing slightly. Moments later, Tony entered the cafe, moving cautiously under the German shepherd's watchful gaze. The young ex-reaper had been cooperating with authorities, his testimony helping to build the case against Ray. "I wanted you to know," Tony said, keeping a respectful distance. "Some of us never knew what Ray was really planning when I found out about the poison. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." He trailed off, his eyes moving to Shadow. "My grandfather was a K9 handler in Vietnam. He used to tell me stories about how those dogs saved lives." David's expression softened slightly. "Shadow's not just a military dog anymore. He's my partner, my guide, my family. But when duty calls, that training kicks in. It's part of who he is." His fingers traced a familiar pattern through Shadow's fur, feeling the dog gradually relax his scrutiny of Tony. The bell above the door chimed as more customers entered. A group of veterans who'd seen the videos and wanted to pay their respects. Shadow acknowledged them with professional courtesy, recognizing the military bearing in their movements. "We're organizing a community safety program," one of the veterans explained, "using what happened here as a template for how trained service dogs can help protect their handlers. Would you and Shadow be willing to help demonstrate proper K9 tactical response?" Before David could respond, Sarah interrupted with news from her phone. The video just hit national media. They're calling it the Newport Beach incident, showing how military working dogs transition to civilian service while maintaining their training. Shadow remained focused on his duties, but his posture carried unmistakable pride. In Afghanistan, he'd been part of an elite unit. Now he was showing the world that military K9s could adapt their combat skills to civilian protection without losing their professional edge. "People need to understand," David said, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "that these dogs never stop serving. They just find new missions, new ways to protect and guide." His hand rested on Shadow's head, feeling the subtle shift as the German Shepherd acknowledged another group of respectful observers entering the cafe. 2 weeks after the beach incident, Newport Beach had transformed. The Coastal Reapers clubhouse stood empty, its members scattered after Ray's arrest. In its place, Morrison and his veteran group had established a community center, focusing on integrating former military working dogs into civilian service roles. Shadow and David had become unofficial ambassadors for the program. The German Shepherd's demonstration of professional military training in a civilian protection role had caught the attention of K9 training facilities across the country. Today, they were meeting with a group of handlers and their dogs at the Coastal Brew, which had become their unofficial headquarters. "It's amazing how he maintains that combat awareness while staying perfectly calm," observed a K9 trainer from San Diego, watching Shadow scan the cafe with practiced efficiency. "Most military dogs struggle with the transition, but he's adapted perfectly." David smiled, feeling Shadow's subtle movements through the harness. He understands the difference between combat threats and civilian situations. In Afghanistan, that adaptability saved lives. Here, it's helping change how people see military working dogs. Sarah had expanded her outdoor seating area, which now included a special section for handlers and their service dogs. The morning crowd had come to expect the sight of various working dogs training alongside Shadow, learning to balance their military background with civilian duties. The DA's office called, Officer Rodriguez reported, joining their table. Ray's pleading guilty to all charges. The evidence was too strong, especially after they analyzed that poison. He watched as Shadow acknowledged his presence with a professional tail wag. "The judge is considering making this a precedent case for attacks on service animals." The bell chimed as Tony entered, now wearing the uniform of a local animal shelter. "Volunteer." Shadow's posture remained alert but accepting, a far cry from their first encounters. "The rehabilitation program's going well," Tony announced, keeping a respectful distance. "We've got 3 former military dogs helping with PTSD therapy sessions." Morrison, who'd taken charge of the community safety program, spread out some papers on their table. "The veteran watch group is expanding to other neighborhoods. We're using Shadow's response as a training model, how to control situations without escalation." Through the window, they could see new security cameras being installed along the boardwalk, part of a community initiative sparked by the incident. Newport Beach had turned a potential tragedy into an opportunity for positive change. "The most remarkable thing," David reflected, his hands steady on Shadow's harness, "is how this has brought the community together. What Ray intended as an act of revenge has become a catalyst for something much bigger." Shadow's ears suddenly pricked forward, but his posture remained relaxed. Moments later, a group of young veterans entered with their service dogs in training. The German Shepherd's example had inspired many handlers to adopt former military K9s, giving these highly trained animals new purpose in civilian life. "We're starting a formal training program," Morrison explained, pointing to his papers, "teaching handlers how to work with dogs that have combat experience. Shadow's shown that military training can be an asset in civilian protection, not a liability." Sarah brought over fresh coffee, pausing to watch the interaction between Shadow and the newer service dogs. "It's like he's teaching them," she observed, "showing them how to stay alert without being aggressive, how to protect without intimidating." David nodded, feeling the precise way Shadow positioned himself, alert but approachable, professional but calm. In Afghanistan, he was part of an elite unit. Now he's building a different kind of team, showing others how to serve in new ways. The morning sun streamed through the coastal brew's windows, highlighting the positive changes that had grown from confrontation. Shadow maintained his watchful guard, but his posture carried a new purpose. Not just protecting David, but helping forge a path for other military dogs to follow. 1 month after the incident, David stood at the podium of Newport Beach's community center, Shadow alert and professional by his side. The audience was filled with veterans, K9 handlers, and community members gathered for the inauguration of the Military Working Dog Transition Program. The German Shepherd's composed bearing seemed to inspire the other service dogs present, each displaying their own blend of military training and civilian adaptation. What happened on that beach wasn't just about one dog protecting his handler. David began, his voice carrying the authority of his SEAL background. It was about showing how the skills these dogs learn in combat can be transformed into something equally valuable in civilian life. His hand found Shadow's fur, drawing strength from the familiar connection. In the front row, Officer Rodriguez sat beside the San Diego K9 training coordinator. The incident had sparked a reimagining of police K9 programs across Southern California, with Shadow's controlled response becoming a model for non-violent threat neutralization. The greatest challenge our military dogs face isn't the transition itself, David continued, but finding opportunities to use their training in meaningful ways. Shadow's ears twitched at his handler's voice, maintaining his professional watch over the gathering. What we're starting here today will help bridge that gap. Sarah Chen, who had transformed the coastal brew into a hub for the program, watched from her seat beside Morrison. The coffee shop's reputation had grown beyond Newport Beach, attracting handlers and trainers from across the country who wanted to observe Shadow's example of successful military to civilian transition. In Afghanistan, Shadow was trained to detect threats, protect his unit, and control hostile situations, David explained. Those same skills allowed him to defend me without causing serious injury, to neutralize a threat while maintaining absolute professional control. The pride in his voice was evident to everyone present. Tony, now a full-time volunteer with the program, sat with a group of other reformed young men who had found purpose. In working with veteran Animal, the incident had sparked an unexpected movement, turning potential troublemakers into advocates for military working dogs. But perhaps the most important lesson, David continued, is how these dogs never stop serving. They simply find new missions, new ways to make a difference. Shadow's posture straightened slightly, as if acknowledging his role in this larger purpose. Through the community center's windows, the beach was visible, the same stretch of sand where Shadow had demonstrated why military K9s were considered elite operators. The incident had transformed not just Newport Beach's approach to community safety, but its entire understanding of what service dogs could achieve. Morrison stood to present the program's first initiative, a partnership with the VA to pair combat veterans with former military working dogs. What Shadow showed us wasn't just about protection, he explained. It was about the incredible bond between handler and dog, and how that connection can help both adapt to civilian life. Shadow's attention never wavered from his duties, but his bearing carried a distinct pride. He had become more than just a service dog or former military K9. He was now a symbol of successful transition, an example for others to follow. The skills these dogs develop in combat zones aren't a liability, David concluded, his voice strong with conviction. They're assets that can be redirected to serve their communities in new ways. Shadow proved that on the beach, and he continues to prove it every day. The applause that followed wasn't just for the speech or the program. It was a recognition of how one incident, one dog's demonstration of professional military training, had catalyzed positive change throughout the community. Shadow remained alert at David's side, ever the professional, even as his example was helping reshape the future for military working dogs across the country. David and Shadow sat at their usual table outside the Coastal Brew, the evening breeze carrying the familiar scent of ocean and coffee. 6 weeks had passed since the beach incident, and Newport Beach had settled into a new normal. Shadow maintained his professional vigilance, but his posture carried a deeper sense of purpose now. "You've started something remarkable here," Morrison said, joining them with his own cup of coffee. He nodded toward the beach, where 2 former military K9s were training with their new handlers. Those dogs would have been considered too intense for civilian life before. Now they're getting a second chance. Shadow's ears tracked the training session while maintaining his primary focus on David's protection, his ability to balance. Multiple duties had become a teaching point for the transition program, showing how military training could adapt to civilian needs. He was always more than just a military dog, David reflected, his hand finding the familiar spot behind Shadow's ear. In Afghanistan, what made him exceptional wasn't just his training. It was his ability to read situations, to understand what was needed in the moment. Sarah emerged from the cafe, carrying fresh coffee and the day's newspaper. The front page featured a story about Ray's sentencing, 15 years for the attempted poisoning of a service animal, among other charges. The case had set a precedent for protecting working dogs. "The DA says your case has sparked changes in how attacks on service animals are prosecuted," Sarah reported, setting down the paper. "They're treating them more like attacks on law enforcement. Officers now, especially when there's military training involved." Shadow's attention shifted briefly as Tony approached with his therapy dog trainee, a former military Belgian Malinois. The German Shepherd's professional courtesy toward the newer dog demonstrated why he'd become a model for the transition program. "Sometimes it takes a crisis to reveal what's been there all along," David mused, feeling Shadow's subtle shifts. Through the harness, these dogs never lost their ability to serve, they just needed the right opportunity to show it. Morrison watched as the training session on the beach wrapped up. "You know, when we started the Veteran Watch Group, I never imagined it would lead to this. Now we've got departments across the country looking at our program, wanting to learn how to work with former military K9s. Shadow's ears suddenly pricked forward, followed by a subtle tail wag, his professional acknowledgement of Officer Rodriguez approaching. The police officer had become a regular evening visitor, often bringing updates about how Shadow's example was influencing K9 training protocols. "Just got word from San Diego," Rodriguez announced, pulling up a chair. "They're implementing a new training program based on Shadow's response that day, teaching police dogs how to control situations without escalation, just like he did." David smiled, remembering the precision Shadow had shown during the confrontation. "In the SEALs, we learned that the most effective operators weren't always the most aggressive. It was about controlled response, about using exactly the right amount of force needed." The sunset painted Newport Beach in golden hues as families strolled the boardwalk, many pausing to respectfully observe Shadow at his post. The German Shepherd had become a local legend, but his professional demeanor remained unchanged, always alert, always ready to serve. "You know what impresses me most?" Sarah said, watching a young veteran with his new service dog pass by. "It's not just what Shadow did that day on the beach. It's what he continues to do, showing these other dogs how to find their place in civilian life." Shadow's posture reflected the truth of her words. He remained the consummate professional, but his example was helping reshape how society viewed military working dogs. Each day brought new handlers seeking to learn from his transition, new dogs finding their way forward through his model. Early morning light bathed Newport Beach in soft colors as David and Shadow made their way along the now familiar path to the coastal brew. 2 months had passed since the incident that changed their community. Shadow moved with his characteristic professional precision, but there was an added dimension to his bearing. The quiet confidence of a warrior who had found a new way to serve. "There they are," Sarah called out warmly, already preparing their usual order. The cafe's morning crowd included several handlers and their dogs, all part of the growing military working dog transition program. Shadow acknowledged his fellow K9s with professional courtesy while maintaining his primary focus on David's. "Protection. Just got the final numbers from the VA," Morrison reported, joining them with a folder of documents. 23 former military dogs successfully placed with handlers in the past month alone, all of them trained using Shadow's model of adaptive response. David's hand found its familiar place on Shadow's harness, feeling the subtle vibrations of alertness that had never dimmed since their combat days. In Afghanistan, we learned that the strongest warriors weren't always the most aggressive. It was about adaptability, about understanding what each situation required. Through the window, they could see Tony leading a training session on the beach, working with a group of former military dogs and their new handlers. The young man who had once run with the Reapers had found his true calling, helping other combat dogs transition to civilian service. "The prosecutor called," Officer Rodriguez said, arriving with his morning coffee. "They're using footage from that day in training seminars now, showing how professional military K9 training can be adapted for civilian protection without losing its effectiveness." Shadow's ears tracked the conversation, while his eyes maintained their vigilant scan of their surroundings. It was this balance between combat readiness and civilian service that had made him a model for others to follow. "You know what I remember most about that day," Sarah reflected, watching the training session on the beach. "It wasn't just how Shadow handled the situation. It was how he showed everyone that these dogs never stop being protectors. They just find new battles to fight, new people to defend." David nodded, memories of their shared combat experiences flowing through his mind. "In the SEALs, we had a saying, 'The mission changes, but the commitment remains.'" Shadow proved that here he showed that military dogs can transition without losing what makes them special. The morning sun climbed higher as Newport Beach came fully alive. Joggers and early beachgoers passed by, many nodding respectfully to Shadow. The German Shepherd had become more than just a local hero. He was a symbol of how military training could be transformed into community service. "The real victory," Morrison observed, watching another group of handlers arrive for training, "isn't just in what happened that day. It's in what's happening now every day, as these dogs find new purpose, new ways to serve." Shadow's posture straightened slightly at Morrison's words, as if acknowledging his role in this larger mission. His military training remained sharp, as ever, but it had evolved into something more, a bridge between his combat past and civilian present. David stood preparing for their morning walk along the beach. Shadow moved in perfect sync with him, their bond as strong as it had been. "In the combat zones of Afghanistan, ready for patrol, boy?" he asked softly, feeling Shadow's immediate response through the harness. The German Shepherd's bearing said everything: alert, professional, ready. He was still the highly trained military K9 who had served with distinction in combat, but now his mission had expanded. Each day brought new opportunities to demonstrate how military working dogs could adapt and serve in civilian life, never losing their warrior spirit while finding new ways to protect and guide. As they moved toward the beach, Shadow maintained his protective watch, ever vigilant, ever faithful. He had shown Newport Beach and the world that a warrior's heart could find new purpose, that the skills honed in combat could bring positive change to a community, and that the deepest, Bonds of service never truly fade. They only grow stronger with each new mission, each new day. Up next, you got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.